Okay, hi everyone, we might get started now. Welcome to the University Centre for Rural Development, our first research seminar of 2025. Before we begin today, I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today. For those of us here in the room, it's the Widjabul people of Bundjalung Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other First Nations people who are joining us here today. Pay respect and celebrate that they are the caretakers of land, waters, story, song and culture, and have been so over millennia. And I do want to acknowledge that today is Close the Gap Day. And I want to acknowledge the importance of respect for First Nations wisdom, self-determination and ongoing resilience in driving the full priority reforms of the Closing the Gap National Agreement and working towards health equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Before we get started, just very brief housekeeping. We see for those here in person, there is tea and coffee available outside with some snacks. Everyone knows where the bathrooms are who is here in person. I will be recording this seminar. So if you don't want to be recorded, please let me know in the chat. For those here in person, please turn your phones on silent. And if you are joining us online, can you please stay mute until the end? If you do have questions as the presentation is being given, please put them in the chat and we will address those in discussion time at the end. We've left a lot of time for discussion, so we really look forward to that part. So without further ado, I want to introduce our presenters today, Dr. Jo Longman and Emma Pittaway. Jo is a senior research fellow based at the University Centre for Rural Health. She's a social scientist working across a diverse range of rurally focused qualitative and mixed methods health research and evaluation projects. She co-led the UCRH's Community Recovery After Flood studies, exploring the experience of flooding and mental health of the community following catastrophic flooding in the Northern Rivers in 2017. She focused on disseminating the key learnings from those studies in the context of the 2022 Northern Rivers floods and landslides. In late 2020, Jo led a project on the mental health impacts of climate change more broadly and building resilience of those impacts in rural communities. In 2022 to 24, she was the chief investigator for the Northern Rivers, a qualitative project exploring self-organising following disaster, and for a project in 2024, exploring disaster management agencies' connections to community. Emma Pittaway became involved in community-led disaster recovery and resilience research, the UCRH, in the aftermath of the catastrophic 2022 Northern Rivers floods and landslides. This research aims to identify the dynamics of community-led disaster organising, understand the interface between community groups and disaster management agencies, and most recently, to follow the emergence of a regional alliance of grassroots community resilience groups. Emma has been a teaching associate at Southern Cross University since 2014, and prior to that at the University of New South Wales. She has a background in community development, refugee advocacy and climate activism, and holds a Masters of Social Development from the University of New South Wales. Today, Jo and Emma will be presenting on the collaboration between disaster management agencies and community-led grassroots groups during and after climate disasters. This seminar will explore the critical role of community-led grassroots organising during and after climate-related disasters like bushfires and floods, focusing on 3 impacted sites in New South Wales. It will draw on data from recent research, interviews and analysis of connections between people groups and disaster management agencies. It will describe how a key barrier to the work of community-led groups was their lack of recognition by disaster management agencies. However, their research also found positive examples of lessons learned and changes enacted since the 2022 Northern Rivers floods and landslides disaster, illustrating the potential for meaningful collaboration when agencies invest in relationship building respect community knowledge, and adopt flexible approaches. We argue for a cultural shift within disaster management agencies to enhance recognition, relationships, trust, and collaboration. So without further ado, please welcome Jo and Emma.
Wow, thanks, Hayley, for that incredibly detailed introduction. I feel like you've really done the whole seminar there. Okay, so a very warm welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming along today. We really appreciate people being in the room with us and online virtually with us. And hello to people who may be listening to this down the track. So I'm Jo Longman, and this is my colleague, Emma Pittaway. And as Hayley has said, we're talking today, bringing together a few research studies, but two studies in particular, around collaboration between community-led grassroots groups and disaster management agencies before, during, and after climate disaster. Okay, now I also had an acknowledgement slide that's very similar to yours, Hayley, so thanks for that lovely acknowledgement, which I would just like to reinforce and to make the point that these lands were never ceded. And also, I guess, to pay our deepest respects to the strengths of First Nations people in responding to climate change and at all times. Okay, so a bit of background to what we're doing in this seminar. We're going to start off with just a very small bit of background, a tiny bit about the UCRH and about the Northern Rivers where this work has been done. And then we're going to focus on two studies. One is about understanding the community-led flood response and recovery, and the other is about connections between disaster management agencies and community-led groups. So Emma and I are going to talk for just about half an hour today. I'm going to talk first and then hand over to Emma. But as Hayley has said, we've left quite a lot of room at the end to pick up a discussion and to answer questions and to have a discussion in the room and online. And if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat. And as always, we are acknowledging that talking about climate disaster can be distressing. So we want to make sure that you please do look after yourselves and look after one another. And on this slide, you can see a number of places where you might be able to get support. So do you know that there is support out there available to look after people? And these are just some of the places where you might want to think about going if you or others you care for need support. Okay, so a tiny bit about the University Centre for Rural Health. We are based in Lismore, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's here, right on the very close to the Queensland border. And we're in a rural area. And we have been around, UCRH has been around since 2001 now. And we are part of the University of Sydney's Faculty of Medicine and Health. And we do two things at UCRH. We offer rural placements for around 800 medical and allied health students. And we then conduct rurally relevant health research. And we have been implementing research here at UCRH on climate change and health, including flooding and including flooding and mental health and wellbeing since the catastrophic flood of 2017. So we've been involved in this topic area for quite some time now. And the Northern Rivers area, where the UCRH is based, is at relatively high risk of climate disasters. And so here's just a timeline to give you some sense of that. And it only goes back to 2017, which actually isn't that long ago. But you can see here floods, drought, fires, then the pandemic, of course, and then catastrophic flooding at the end of February and at the end of March 2022, fires in late 2023, and then just 2 weeks ago, the gift to us that was ex-tropical cyclone Alfred that caused massive disruption in the whole of the Northern Rivers in a whole bunch of different ways. And I do want to acknowledge how difficult that time was for everybody and how incredibly disruptive it was. And that really many of us are just beginning to come up for air. So we've been through a huge number of climate disasters very recently. And Lismore itself, and I'm talking about the whole of the Northern Rivers today, but Lismore itself is sometimes called the most flood-prone town in Australia. And you can see, I think, from this chart why that might be. So this chart goes back since records began in 1870. And you can see, I hope, that the worst flood on record was in 2022. So the river peaked at 14.4 metres in 2022. And here, this dotted line on this chart here shows you the 1 in 100 year flood level. And really that flood was so enormous and unprecedented that it actually provided spaces, or in fact the necessity for some really quite extraordinary change and innovation. And it's been our job to an extent here at the University Centre for Rural Health to try and capture and record some of that extraordinary change and innovation. And part of this presentation is going to cover that. I do just want to also say that obviously, unfortunately, weather-related events like floods are predicted to become more frequent and more severe in the future. So this is just a snippet from a graphic in a paper that we published from UCRH in 2023. There's quite a lot of information on this graph, but what I want you to focus on is this autumn change in the percentage of rainfall. And in the near future, which is up to 2039, that's predicted to go up by 9%. And in the far future, so that's way off up into 2079, it's predicted to go up by around 15%. So the urgency for us to really learn from what we have learned in 2022 and also 2 weeks ago is kind of writ large, I think, in these climate change predictions. Okay, so back to these two studies around community-led grassroots groups and their collaboration with disaster management agencies before, during and after climate disaster. So what we mean by community-led disaster organising is place-based grassroots community-led groups outside of the formal disaster management agency sector and not in receipt of recurrent government funding. And we have lots of examples of those kind of groups in the Northern Rivers, including places like the Koori Mail and the Koori Kitchen. So the Koori Kitchen was feeding around 800 people every day for months following the 2022 floods. And there are also multiple sort of pop-up mushroom groups, for want of a better description, that proliferated in the Northern Rivers, particularly in the hills, in places where people were cut off. Okay, so those groups, those kind of coming together of people, those hubs, ended up really being central response and recovery hubs in all sorts of places across the Northern Rivers. And many of those groups are still functioning. And just 2 weeks ago, in the build-up to Cyclone Alfred, we saw those groups swinging into action. And it was really impressive what those groups did in the lead-up to Alfred. And they're still looking after people in the aftermath. So study one, as we call it in this presentation, is around community-led disaster organising in the Northern Rivers. Now, this study was part of a larger study that looked at 3 different places across New South Wales with different types of disaster and slightly different populations. But for this presentation, we're just focusing on the Northern Rivers. So we have done a whole seminar previously on this study. And I've asked Hayley to put the link to the podcast. UCRH has a YouTube channel, and we have a podcast of that seminar. So if people want to find out more detail about this study, go and have a look at the podcast for our previous seminar. But in brief, the study took place between August 22 and February 2024. And we conducted 29 detailed interviews with community organisers across the Northern Rivers, across different places, so different geographies, different size and group and types of group, and the different kinds of activities that those groups undertook. And this work was funded by the state government, and a massive thanks to everybody who was involved in some way or another in the study. So I've got 3 slides about the main findings of this study. First of all, this slide gives you a sense of what community disaster organising looks like. What sorts of things were people doing in a sort of response phase, in a recovery phase, and then in the longer term recovery, resilience and adaptation phase. And I'm just going to point out a few things on this list. So I think most people will know about rescuing people in the 2022 floods, but also doing welfare checks in their communities, setting up evacuation centres, so providing accommodation for people and feeding people, as I've already mentioned. In the sort of recovery phase, really helping people with ongoing cleanup and also, importantly, liaising with disaster management agencies. And then in the long-term recovery, really helping people rebuild their homes, helping people access grant funding, and also participating in disaster management processes. And I want to say here that I'm hoping you can see the obvious link here, both in the short term and in the longer term, on people's health, their physical health and their mental health and well-being, for all these kinds of things that these community groups are doing. And that's why UCRH is doing this kind of work, because we're really interested in how the health of our communities is maintained and robust as it can be in the face of this kind of the face of these sorts of climate disasters. So that's why we're doing this kind of research. And this DAISY diagram gives you a strong sense, I think, of the huge variety of strengths of community-led disaster organising. I'm just going to pick a few things out. In the centre, to start with, that community-led disaster organising actually plays a specialised, sophisticated and indispensable role in disasters. And that's partly because of some of these things that are the petals of this daisy. So, for example, communities understand who their members are, what their needs are, and can offer tailored support, right? So they're going to know who in their community is living with a disability or is living alone or who is elderly and might need some additional support. So they know that stuff. They're also able to draw on local knowledge and specialised skills and existing connections. So we heard examples of, you know the person who's got a tractor, right, who might be able to help. Or you might know the person who's got some medical or nursing training behind them who might be able to help if you're a cut-off community. We also saw that communities are able to provide safe and accessible spaces for their members. And finally, I want to point out this important petal here, which is that community organising itself actually builds local connection and place-based resilience. And from our 2017 flood work, it was very clear from that people who had stronger feelings of belonging to a community and more informal social connectedness, those people had better mental health when we measured their mental health 6 months after the 2017 flood. So we know that issue about being connected and being part of a community is a positive and protective factor in general for people's mental health and well-being. Okay, so that's a massively important part and a strength of community-led disaster organising. Okay, this is my final slide about this particular study. So we asked community organisers what they really needed and what their main challenges were. And they told us lots of things, but we want to concentrate down these first 2 things here. So they talked about recognition of their role by the emergency management and government sectors and support for their role from the emergency management and government sectors. And this recognition piece isn't really about a pat on the back and saying, yeah, well done, community, you're marvellous, you did really well. It's not really about that. It's more about genuinely recognising that specialised, sophisticated and indispensable role that communities can play in the midst of something like a climate disaster. And so that recognition piece, it's not just about people feeling, upset or distressed about being overlooked in some way. It's actually more fundamental than that. It's about inequities and structural exclusion from decision making. And so I'm going to hand over to Emma now, who's going to talk about our second study, and she'll pick up on some of those points. Thanks, Emma.
So following on from study one, where we identified this challenge that community groups experienced with a lack of recognition and support from disaster management agencies, we recognise that this issue of how to do good collaboration between the two is really central, and that we needed to talk to staff from disaster management agencies as well to understand their perspectives on it. And so we interviewed 12 disaster management staff within the boundaries of the Lismore, Kyogle and Richmond Valley local government areas. So just a small study, interviewing personnel who ideally had been in their role at the time of the flood in 2022, and whose roles involved them being out and about and interacting with community. And this study was funded by the Sydney Environment Institute at Sydney University. And we were interviewing them a bit more than 2 years after the flood, the 2022 flood, so well into the recovery journey. And we asked them about their connections to community and what they and their agencies had learned in those 2 years about collaborating with community. So for simplicity, I'm just going to use the term disaster management agencies throughout this presentation. So what do I mean by disaster management agencies? This is an umbrella term to include all agencies, government departments and NGOs with a formal role in all phases of disaster management, so prevention, preparation, response and recovery. And so that includes what we would typically think of as emergency management agencies, the combat agencies, such as New South Wales Police, SES and RFS. But it also includes government agencies such as the National Emergency Management Agency and the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. It includes local councils and also some authorised NGOs such as the Red Cross and Anglo-Care. We asked interviewees about their own connections to community groups before, during and since the 2022 floods. And we mapped how the connections evolved from 2022 to 2024 when we were interviewing them. And on these network maps, you don't need to worry about the different colours. They just indicate different areas within the 3 local government areas. What we're interested in looking at here are the lines connecting disaster management personnel, who are represented here as circles, to the grassroots community groups, who are represented as squares. So the map on the left shows the connections that were active before the flood. In the middle shows connections active during the flood, and on the right shows those that have developed in the recovery period since. And as you can see, we found that connections between community and disaster management agencies were sparse before and during the flood, but that they have really flourished since. So this small study became a case study of how collaboration can be improved. And as a caveat, I want to be clear that we're not saying that everything that's happening in these 3 local government areas in relation to disaster management and recovery is an example of good collaboration. But the value of our small study was that we were able to speak to some individuals in disaster management who'd been on this journey of learning and understanding about how to work with community, as a result of their experience. And because their voices are in the minority within the disaster management sector, then it's really important that we learn from them. Why are these connections between community and disaster management agencies so important? The disaster management personnel that we spoke to said first and foremost to avoid duplication, chaos and crucially loss of life during emergencies. But also it enables disaster management agencies to better support the important work being done by community groups. It improves community trust in disaster management agencies because communities feel seen and listened to. And it reduces the impact of trauma and trauma of future disasters, not only for the community as a whole, but also for the disaster management personnel who, often are of the community themselves or from the community themselves. And this is all supported by existing research and it's recognised within the sector. So disaster management policy in Australia reflects the international emphasis on shared responsibility that's enshrined in the Sendai framework. And there is also an increasing emphasis in disaster management policy on involving community in all phases of disaster management. So it's not, we already know that this is an important thing to get right, and we know why it's so important. Where there are gaps in the knowledge and understanding, though, is how best to do it. And so this was our main research question. What makes for good collaboration between disaster management agencies and community? And our key finding was about the importance of relationships of trust between individual community organisers and individual disaster management personnel. And these, of course, take time, they're one-on-one, they're based on mutual respect, and there's really no shortcut to building this kind of relationship of trust. So in our study, these happened because some of our interviewees, some disaster management personnel, went above and beyond their roles, in reaching out to the community, supporting the community, showing up for community events. Several participants made the point that it's important to do this consistently because the next time there's a flood, it's too late. You want to be riding the bike the next time there's a flood, not still building it. And so we heard examples of senior disaster management staff taking time out to go out into the streets and literally sit down with community groups and have a cup of tea and a yarn. And other examples of staff continuing to make time to attend community meetings and events, even after their agencies had directed them back to their business as usual roles. And so they were doing this in their own time because they realised how critically important it was to maintain these relationships during, what they call peacetime. And here's a quote from a disaster management staff member that demonstrates this growing understanding of the way that trust is built. Relationships take time, getting to know people, hanging out, and that's what happened. Our relationship with the community groups has evolved and changed in so many ways, just with time spent hanging out and supporting in whatever way we can. So this leads us to our second finding about what makes good collaboration happen. And this is mutual recognition and a willingness to work together. So it's about disaster management agencies recognising the strengths of community-led organising and the value of collaborating with community groups. And it's about communities also working willingly with disaster management agencies. And on the part of the agencies, this involves recognising that communities are willing and want to be involved and want to sit at the decision-making table. This was a revelation for some of the disaster management personnel that we interviewed as they got to know community groups in the aftermath of the flood. So one disaster management interviewee said, "I think one thing that we've identified is the importance of community. They well and truly want to be involved now in being prepared in their response space and what does their recovery look like." And then based on these relationships of trust, recognition, respect, collaboration can happen. And our interviewees described this, as one interviewee put it, slowly that relationship built, where we just started exchanging information and jobs and helping each other out. So far, our findings about what supports collaboration have emphasised the importance of relationships over systems and structures. But the disaster management personnel we interviewed also emphasised the importance of some new communication structures to facilitate better two-way flow of information next time a disaster strikes. And the main example that was mentioned was a new resilience and recovery subcommittee, which creates a place for community groups within the formal disaster management structure for the Northern Rivers. So its aim is to give community groups a direct line of communication with Disaster Management Command during emergencies and beyond emergencies as well, during peacetime. It's only recently got up and running, and it's the first of its kind in Australia. So good communication structures are also important. But what we heard from both studies was that new structures are likely to fail if they don't have community ownership and community buy-in right from the start, and if they're not built on a genuine respect for community by disaster management agencies. What we heard strongly from the community organisers in study 1, and then this was also echoed by some of the disaster management personnel interviewed in study 2, was that new structures are meaningless unless the disaster management personnel involved supported a genuine two-way flow of information instead of seeing it as a channel for a one-way provision of information and directives to the community. And also a genuine sharing of power and providing community with a seat at the decision-making table. And this quote reflects the understanding that grew amongst some of the disaster management personnel in this area. So the good thing about the new subcommittee is it's not government designed. It's got community input about what it's going to look like, how it can work best. Because if we put a force structure on community, they're going to say, doesn't suit my needs, see you later, not interested. Disaster management personnel said that the biggest challenge was culture and systems change needed within disaster management agencies. So despite this growing understanding about the value of community, they reported that elitist and paternalistic attitudes persist and that these devalue the community as chaotic, as unskilled, and as a risk to be managed. And because personnel don't always feel supported by their own agencies to collaborate with communities, a number of our interviewees also reported having to find creative workarounds so that they could support community initiatives or provide the help that communities were asking for without getting into trouble. So one interviewee described an act first, ask later approach that they adopted to ensure that rigid policies didn't get in the way of a common sense support for community, in a very fast-paced and fast-moving situation. And another quote from an interviewee, how do we connect a round hole to a square peg? Disaster management agencies are very rigid. We've got a square peg. How do we fit that into the community that's a round hole, that's very fluid and different? Well, there's got to be something in the middle. We've got to come to the middle ground somewhere. And again, this isn't an entirely new understanding. Our interviewees themselves acknowledge that change is happening, but they were frustrated because it's gradual and it's patchy and they felt like their own learning isn't being listened to enough within their sector. So these findings support what other research has already shown about the need for culture change and also what is reflected in disaster management policy about the importance of collaboration. And what our research adds is a better understanding about what's needed to support effective collaboration, and it provides some tangible examples of how this can happen. And there are three takeaways about what enables good collaboration. Firstly, recognition. So disaster management agencies recognising the strengths of community and the value of collaborating with community-led groups. Secondly, building relationships of trust as the essential foundation for collaboration. And then more broadly, culture change within the disaster management sector towards a collaborative and inclusive culture that values community strengths. And I'm going to end with this fantastic quote that shows the journey that some disaster management personnel in this area have been on since 2022. I'm just the greatest advocate now for community involvement in the emergency management space, because community are going to do it anyway, and you can't try and control them. Even trying to coordinate sometimes can be challenging, but you just got to go along with the ride and provide them with the support and the information to allow them to get on and do their job. And we're not talking about a dysfunctional group of people. Most of these people are highly functioning, highly organised. Some of their systems are better than the emergency management organisations. So I think from an emergency management point of view, we've got to get it out of our head that we're the one-stop shop, because we're not. And this event proved it. So I'll finish with a thank you to the audience, a really big thank you to our project participants and also to our project partners and funders. And we'll open up now to comments and questions from the floor. Thanks, everyone.
So ceiling mics, the floor mics are enabled. So if anyone just wants to speak out and ask questions, you should be
Maybe we'll see first if there's a question online. Was there anything in the chat, Hayley?
Not yet, but I will just check. Yeah? No, not yet. I'll write something. Okay.
I suppose that it's, even though this cyclone was a difficult thing, it was really wonderful to see a lot of these things put into place. And I think we can all be thankful that there was so much, like even with the SES, there were a bunch of guys with their tinnies already up in Yellowbar. There were other people organising food areas, other people organising, and so it was a fantastic collaborative situation where people just went, yeah, come on, I'm ready. And you know, just looking at that information, it does show the community really counted. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, here to that. Yeah.
A question, Jo and Emma, on the sustainability of the collaboration, because it does sound like it really does depend on the personnel and their personality types. You know, they're not paternalistic, they see the value. You do need that systems change in the agencies. And I wondered too, following the 2017 flood, why we would see a bit more network there in the, you know, before phase of 2022, or, you know, did it happen after 2017 and it just fell away and then it reinvigorated again after 2022? Do you have any comments?
They're fantastic comments and questions. Thanks, Veronica. So I take that first. Yeah, a really interesting observation about why did we not see quite so much of that after 2017. I do think there was something particular about 22 that it was so catastrophic and so widespread, and that there was a lot of people cut off, I think. And so I think it was the first time that some of these agencies actually sort of recognising what we're able to see. It was very visible, more visible perhaps than it had been in 2017. And as Emma was saying, you know, if you look at any of these disaster management frameworks or, you know, strategy documents or policy documents, they all say community is really important, you know, we've really got to make connections with the community. But when you actually talk to personnel, you find that, you know, their business as usual roles don't really accommodate that. Or maybe there's one person that's got, you know, community engagement as their role description, but, you know, they cover some enormous geography. So they're spread so thin, they can't actually do what they need to do. So I think sustainability and those points about systems change and about, you know, it sounds like a small thing, this new committee, and it's like, well, what's a committee going to do? But actually that's a big deal for disaster management agencies to have made this actually very fundamental route in for community into the, you know, inner sanctum of the way that the disaster management agencies work together in a disaster. But there's probably a few other things to say about what disaster management agencies can do systems-wise that might help make this more sustainable. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, the systems change is, of course, the really difficult part of it. And it's true that these relationships of trust are very much one-to-one, and necessarily so, but that's where their strength lies. I think that that's where the finding about the importance of recognition is crucially important as well, because that recognition is, as Jo said, this is not just kind of, you know, recognition in the sense of patting community groups on the back for being involved. This is a fundamental recognition of the unique strengths that community ways of organising have, that they can actually address needs that the disaster management formal sector can't address, and therefore that there's, you know, this inherent value of collaborating. And the challenge is having that recognition understood across the sector and within agencies, you know, within all roles through within agencies. So quite a few interviewees talked about the fact that an understanding of community was almost like a specialised skill that was held by a couple of community engagement officers. And it really needs to be spread across the agencies. So it's part of that, you know, that culture change in systems change work that needs to happen.
We've got plenty of questions in the chat now. So I thought we might actually stop screen sharing to the lovely faces we can see by online participants. And I'll pull the chat up so we can start.
We want to change the view so that we've got all the people.
How's that?
That's great. All the people.
Are we reading the questions in the chat?
I can read them if you like, just so that everyone can see the questions. The first one is from Megan Harris. A similar project's going to be run this year to further explore this topic and in relation to mental health.
Thanks, Megan. That's a good question. I think from the UCRH point of view, there are some projects that are underway which allow us to look in more detail, in particular at the community-led groups and how they impact on the mental health of community. So we've just found out that we have a Peregrine Centre grant, which will start in July this year, which will give us funding to look at that in much more detail. So it's got a very strongly rural mental health focus. And it's about going back to those community groups that we've now been working with for some years, and looking at what it is that they do that supports and impacts positively on the mental health and wellbeing of communities. I think it would be amazing to do more work in this disaster management space. So a bit further down the track, we're at the point at the moment of working out with the disaster management agencies what are the right next steps forward. So we've been trying to work quite carefully with them to work out who needs to know more widely about this research and the other studies that feed into it, and what's the best way of trying to nudge along some of this culture change, and some of the developments in the systems and structures that are required to support the kind of work that needs to happen. So I hope that answers your question, Megan. Do you have anything to say?
Just that the second study that looked at the collaboration between community and disaster management agencies was a very small study, and we would love opportunities to extend it. And at the moment, the form that that's taking is talking to people in the sector and seeing how can we share these findings with people in the sector. So that has involved recently going along to one of the meetings of the local disaster management command, it's called the Local Emergency Management Committee, and presenting these findings there and, having a discussion with them. How can we have these conversations with people in your agencies? Who do you think needs to hear them and so on? So that's where we're taking this at the moment.
There's lots of congratulations. Thank you for presenting. A question from Louise Mitchell. One of the issues with disaster research is getting the ethics approval through quickly. We were actually speaking about this yesterday. I have the same question. How did you get the ethics approval? What was the time frame in regard to this and the research?
Fantastic question, Louise. Yeah, that's not unique to this study. Issues with trying to get ethics through quickly. And I think this is happening more and more with these sort of small one-off type studies where you've got, a small amount of funding you can apply for, but there's a quick deadline and you've got to be delivering on this project within 12 months kind of thing. And so I think that's really sort of bringing this issue of ethics into sharp relief, that's actually quite difficult. So we got an announcement that we had this funding, I think, in December, and we worked over Christmas and the New Year to write the ethics, and the ethics went in January, and I think we got ethics approved in February from memory and started our data collection pretty soon after that. So our experience here is that the ethics process is actually getting a bit longer and longer. So now it seems to be taking sort of 3 months or so to actually get things through ethics, and the ethics committees are filling up, which they never used to have a top stop, but good on them to say, yeah, we can't take any more applications than this amount. But I don't think I have a solution to that, except maybe we need, more ethics committees.
Well, or you can have a generic project that's been approved and then just put in an amendment, and that's usually much faster. So maybe that's a sort of a system solution going forward.
Yeah. I hope people online heard that from Megan, but the idea is if you had a more of an umbrella ethics that went in, then you could just put a modification into the existing ethics to add things in studies. And we've certainly had some good experiences of doing that, haven't we? And adding studies on, or adding an extra bit to something. Yeah. It's having the foresight to be able to predict far enough out what that thing looks like. Anything else?
Yeah. There was a comment from Naomi Jansen. Thank you, Emma, for doing fantastic research. I'd like to comment as well about the challenges we have providing for vulnerable demographics. I was involved in supporting pregnant, postpartum / breastfeeding women. It's a very vulnerable group in our community efforts. And that was followed up by Megan Harris again. I would also like to know if those vulnerable to domestic violence had added challenges, i.e. needing to remain in shelters, perhaps even with perpetrators of domestic violence, or was community groups developed in order to support this population or this group?
In study one, where we talked to community organisers who were working in various parts of the Northern Rivers, we did hear some stories of people being unsafe in evacuation spaces particularly. And yes, there was some grassroots organising that happened around evacuation centres. So things like professionally trained social workers and psychologists from some minority communities themselves. So diverse gender and sexual background and First Nations going to the evacuation centres and providing support and actually really experiencing that lack of recognition at a very interpersonal level because they were not made to feel welcome in providing their services, despite being able to diffuse some really difficult situations and provide support to people who didn't feel comfortable going to people in positions of authority. So yes, we didn't. We tried to reach as many different demographics as we could in study one, and we spoke to a number of people from some diverse and vulnerable communities, but it wasn't a significant focus of our research.
That's a really important point though, thanks, Sam.
I might bring it back to the floor if there's any questions in person before I continue. There are a few comments online. A few from, I just want to read out some commentary. So one more thing that your research brings to mind, from 2010 to 2015 at the Australian Emergency Management Institute, our program had a 4-day competency-based course on community emergency management with the purpose of culture change for response and agency actors. Systems change is quite the challenge too. And there's been quite a few resources shared as well. I've saved the chat so we can make sure we can review that and share some of those resources with the attendees.
I'd be interested to hear from Louise about how that went at the AMI programme from 2010 to 2015. That'd be really interesting to find out a bit more about that.
Yeah, any time. Yeah, unless I see there's not much time left, so I won't speak about it now.
Okay, yeah, let's meet after this. That sounds like a really interesting thing we should know about.
Yeah. And the time frame there, 2010 to 2015, just emphasises how long this systems change takes. And this is written into all the policies and the procedures. But it's the cultural changes, the actual recognition of the value of community that is slow to happen.
But don't you think people and organisations learn from experience? They can have all the frameworks and they can have all the policies and all, but it's just so much sitting on the shelf until it happens, and then you go. And the 2022 flood was so extreme.
Yeah.
That I think for many people really, and I'm not doing this research, but it just seems like that.
Yeah.
It's the experience of that finally makes it real for people and valuable.
Yeah, I think so. And the visibility of it, within that experience. I know this time, picking up on your point about what happened in the cyclone, that somebody was recounting to me just last week that somebody, I won't say who, but had sort of just suddenly seen what the community was actually doing. Somebody from a disaster management agency had been exposed to that and seen that happening and kind of went, how is this working? How is this working? And the person who was telling me that they literally had to draw a little mud map on the back of a bit of paper, kind of going, okay, this is the LEMC, and this is how the community resilience networks feed into that, and here's all how the hubs feed into that community network. And so an amazing moment for that person to actually, for this, the stars to align a bit or whatever, where they could actually go, this is really important. What are we doing to support this happening? And so I think you're absolutely right. I think being really visible and being, to have that person experience of it, it's but we can't recommend that as a researcher. Everyone has to go through a catastrophe, climate, disaster. So we have to somehow build on what's been learned here and make sure that it reaches the audience that it needs to reach, and to do our bit.
Yeah. And we captured that frustration amongst our participants in that second study. These disaster management personnel who, as you say, had learned through the experience. And it was a profoundly transformative experience for some of us. And their frustration is that they now want to share this within their agencies and the sector, and, how to open up opportunities for others in different roles, different parts of the agency to really.
We have 2 minutes, and there's time for one more question. There is another little question from Louise in the chat. Sometimes after disasters, there are lots of researchers that come in an area. Did you find that? Did it affect the volunteering for your research? Did you have pre-existing relationships with community organisers? i.e., are some of the researchers living in the communities that were impacted? Are these groups interested in hearing back from your research? Lots of questions.
Wow, great questions.
Yeah.
You go. No, I'll go. Okay, so absolutely. So as I outlined at the beginning, UCRH is actually based in the Northern Rivers. And, I showed you that timeline of what the Northern Rivers has experienced since 2017. And so we have this team of embedded researchers. So we're, an integral part of the community here. We're all volunteering in one way, shape or form. And so the 2022 research that we did with community organisers, we found it really easy to recruit to that. And I know that's unusual for, qualitative researchers to be able to say, recruitment was easy, but it was actually very straightforward because lots of people really wanted to take part in that work. And so that made a massive difference. But of course, the flip side of that is that, we are also massively affected by the disasters happening here to us and our community that we love. So, that's the kind of flip side, I suppose. And we just published a paper last week, actually, that looked at using a trauma-informed approach to working with communities like this. There's a number of us here today who were involved in that paper. And so when we went into the 22 research, we were, especially cognizant of that and did some additional training. And we had a really amazing trauma counsellor who worked alongside us as a supervisor. To make sure that the researchers were okay. So there is a bit of a flip side to having embedded researchers, but I think it's a sort of fundamental thing that's really generally positive and helpful. And since 22, I have been keeping a list of all the flying research that's been happening in this community. And let me tell you, it's a very, very long list. It's mind-boggling quite how much work where people have flown into this area, they've got the data that they need, and then they fly out, and the people in the community are like, what happened there? How has our life changed, off the back of this? And so some of our community have got quite a strong sense of what one colleague calls being harvested, which I think is a really incredibly vivid way of thinking about it. But we try really hard to do work in a way that's very connected and integrated into community, and is very alert to need in community and tries to give back to community in a really obvious and constructive way. One thing Emma mentioned when she was talking a moment ago was about the Northern Rivers Community Resilience Alliance, which is an alliance of all these groups. And one of the key things that they told us in 2022 was we really need something to help us talk to one another, right? We've all been doing this thing full on, and we're all reinventing the wheel in our own, space, what would be fantastic is a mechanism to help us talk to each other and to have a unified voice to work with disaster management agencies. And so part of what we've done is to help support the development of that alliance, and we've recently won 2 small research grants which will help us record the emergence of that alliance, which again is something really important to share with other communities, because we're on the front foot here in the Northern Rivers, but other communities will be following in our footsteps.
Just add a couple of very brief points to that. I realise we need to wrap up. Yeah, it's a great question, Louise, and we probably should have mentioned that we are embedded researchers at the beginning of the project. We also found it incredibly easy to recruit for the second study, disaster management personnel, and we weren't sure whether it would be or not when we started out. But essentially what we got were people who were themselves passionate about this question because they had been through this experience, this journey over the last 2 years, and feel really passionate about finding ways to get the message out. And so it was quite interesting to find those people working away in the Northern Rivers area. And like Jo said, we've put an enormous effort into coming back to the communities that we've interviewed afterwards. We ran a series of workshops after we interviewed community organisers in study 1 with the purpose of saying, this is what we found, but how can we make this meaningful for you? What kind of output would actually be meaningful for communities like yours? And that's where this idea to help kickstart this Northern Rivers Community Resilience Alliance came from.
Okay, thanks so much for those great questions, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack and Jo. That's time.
Okay.
Have a good evening, everyone.